good morning to you all. Fantastic start to this Arab Strategy Forum, and I'm delighted that once again I'm here with a superb lineup of guests. It's always an absolute pleasure to look back at this stage, at this forum, on where we've been and where we are headed into 2019 this year. We've got 40 minutes. I'll do 30 minutes with these guys. I will leave 10 minutes for questions from you, the esteemed audience. What a year we have had. Let me briefly remind you of some of the highlights. New leaders in Brazil and in Italy, old leaders staying put in Russia and in Venezuela, others leaving the political arena in Germany, some losing their sunken status in France, the Trump-Kim summit, the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the US embassy relocation to Jerusalem, flare-ups in Gaza, a day of sunshine and celebration for a right royal wedding in the UK, 364 days of Brexit stalemate in Britain, and absolutely no clarity to date. French protests and questions about the existential threat to the project of the European Union. Political drama in Washington. Fun fact, Rex Tillerson was still Secretary of State in January this year. The Kavanaugh hearing, the Khashoggi affair, the US midterm elections, and the coming to power of the Democrats in the House. And lurking behind all of that drama in Washington, of course, is the Mueller investigation, the hoax of the century, as the US president will call it, or does call it. I am not breaking any news here when I say a lot has happened this year, and we know that many of these events will shape what will happen in the world in 2019. And what a great group, as I say, of scholars I have here to walk us through where they think we are at and where we are going. Dennis Ross is a former assistant to President Obama and US National Security Senior Director for the Central Region. Bernardino León is the Director General of the Emirates Diplomatic Academy and former UN representative and head of the UN support mission, of course, to Libya. And a friend of my show, as both of these other gentlemen are, of course, as well, but a regular contributor to my show, Connect the World with Becky Anderson, which is broadcast, as you will well know, weekdays from Abu Dhabi and has been over the last 5 years. Fawaz Gerges is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, author of many, many brilliant books, including The Making of the Arab World. Gentlemen, you have 140 seconds, that's just over 2 minutes, within the spirit of this sort of social media era here. I'm not giving you 140 characters. You get 140 seconds to just tell us where you think we are headed in 2019. Dennis, the floor is yours. Okay, 2 minutes,
2 minutes,
20
right.
seconds.
So, I'm not going to do the world in 140 seconds, but I'll pick two areas that reflect a kind of style and emblem of President Trump in foreign policy, which is the emblem of maximum pressure. He believes maximum pressure has worked with North Korea. I think it's fair to say the jury is out on that, although what you have seen is an end to overt testing of ICBMs and of nuclear warheads. So that at least has calmed things. There will be in 2019 another summit between he and Kim Jong-un. I don't know that it will be transformative. I suspect that it will continue to keep a kind of steady state with uncertainty. I don't think we're going to see a fundamental breakthrough, but I think we will at least see somewhat of a steady state and not a devolution into, or an escalation into a big crisis. With Iran, there's a conventional wisdom that says that there's no way the Iranians will come back into negotiations to revise the JCPOA. You'll recall that President Trump, when he pulled out of it, said, and I quote, that the Iranians say they're not prepared to negotiate now. If I were in their place, I would say the same thing, but when they're ready, I will be ready, willing, and able. The interesting question to watch, and here I would say this is an indicator, the Iranians historically, when they felt under great pressure internally, have looked for ways to reduce that pressure on the outside. If the manifestations of discontent because the economy becomes so squeezed, and they were already suffering real problems even prior to the imposition of the oil sanctions now. If that creates real pressures on the inside, and it remains to be seen, then I think there's a possibility they could look to come back, but not directly with the U.S. I think they would try to work through the Russians, have the Russians be a kind of mediator with the U.S. The key will be, A, the Iranians want to outlast Trump right now. If they think that they can manage the pressures within, that the discontent won't be so extreme, then they'll try to outlast Trump and wait for what they hope will be a different American president. If it turns out that they find it too difficult to manage these pressures, then they will look for a way out. Don't be surprised if they then try through the Russians or someone else to seek some kind of mediation with the United States. That, however, will be accompanied by greater pressure within the region. Since I'm going to run out of my 140 seconds, I'll simply say the one area where I believe there is a real danger of a serious escalation that starts between Hezbollah and Israel because of Hezbollah's effort with Iran to create precision guidance on on the large numbers of rockets that it has. That's something Israel won't live with. That, in the coming year, could be a real flashpoint for escalation.
Fascinating. The crystal ball is yours, Bernardino.
Thanks, Becky. I think it's going to be more a transition year than a disruption year. And it will be a year probably where we will see a lot of sport. And let me explain this. We will continue to see probably a lot of judo between Russia and the rest of the world. And I say judo because, as you know, Putin is a practitioner of that sport politically too. He uses more the weaknesses of his rivals than the strengths Russia has. And we will continue to see that, investing the weaknesses, political weaknesses in the American political system, in European political system. Between the US and China, I don't think it will be judo, but it will not be boxing. It will be maybe something like sumo. Two heavyweights pushing each other outside of the ring, using their strength but no blood, no hitting each other. I don't think any of them at this stage can afford such a fight. I think we'll see probably more cockfighting or kickboxing in US politics. Both sides, I think, Trump has set a style of politics where there is a lot of aggressiveness and the need to see a conflict, a strong conflict and polarization. And I think next year we'll see more of that internally. Whereas in Europe, it is going to be more chameleonic. In Europe and other places, not cock-fighting, but chameleons fighting, because I think nationalists, populists, now that they are exercising power, will have to moderate. Whereas mainstream parties will need to become more populist. Let's see what Macron has announced recently. So they will have to move in that direction to survive. So we'll see more chameleonic fights.
We're going to come to Europe. You make some fascinating points. Fawaz, finally, 2 minutes, 20 seconds, clock's on.
Well, I mean, if we look at the international system, I want to move the discussion a bit from the great powers to social movement. If we look at 2019 and trends, what are the social trends? In PowerPoints, I think you're going to witness in 2019 the momentum of the far-right populist movement is going to really continue to make major momentum throughout Europe. In Britain, in France, in Italy. Remember, 2019, you have elections for the European Union, and far-right movements are expected to make major gains, point one. Point two, the big question for Europe, will President Macron survive the violent storm that's unfolding in Paris? It's 50-50%. There's a chance that France could really basically collapse like a ripened fruit in the lap of the far-right movement. If elections were to take place in France today, and I know France very well, I teach there, Marine Le Pen would be the president of the Republic, point one. Point two, I think what we need to keep in mind is that my take on it is that the most dangerous theater in the world today is not just the Ukraine and Russia. The most dangerous theater in the world is the Lebanese-Israeli border. It would take a trigger, basically, to really create a big fire, region-wide fire. We're going to see also, Becky, major decline in terrorism throughout the world. 2017, we have witnessed 27% decline in terrorist attacks worldwide. I think the trend will continue. And also, finally, on this particular point, that I think I see a glimmer of hope for Yemen. It seems to me that even though we're not going to see peace coming to Yemen, but the war itself in Yemen is winding down. Finally, on the US, I know you're very much interested in the deal of the century. It's a gimmick. Nothing will happen on the Israeli-Palestinian track, more of the same. I think the deal itself, as it's being really framed in Washington, is more about wishful thinking than reality, because it has moved US foreign policy away from the parameters of international law and the parameters of, President Trump's predecessors, that is fully committed the United States on the side of the far-right governments in Israel.
Let's stick with that last point then, because I want to talk about this deal of the century, and it alludes to what happens in the US and what sort of position Donald Trump is in going forward. You say you don't think we'll see that deal of the century. Why? Tell me why you don't think we'll see it.
Well, I have no doubts in my mind that a plan is in the making in Washington. So we know this. But the plan basically is dramatically different from John Kerry's ideas that have been gathering dust in the State Department. The reason why I'm very skeptical about the plan, because if I were President Trump, I would have tried to build trust between the Palestinians and the Israelis. If I were President Trump, I would not really have positioned the United States sidely on the powerful with the powerful player, that's Israel. In fact, President Trump has undermined the moral authority of the United States as a mediator, let alone as an honest broker. The United States has never been an honest broker, and Dennis can correct me on this particular point. Any particular settlement that does not take into account the critical core concerns of the Palestinians and the Israelis, a two-state solution. It's simple. There's consensus, overwhelming consensus. Even American presidents believe in a two-state solution. A Palestinian state, the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. In fact, just a few days ago, I watched an interview with Jared Kushner, who is the lead man on in which he says that the deal itself, it will mostly be unveiled in 2-3 months. And he made two statements that really struck me very much. He said the deal itself will provide Israeli security for life and will give the Palestinians better lives. Better life. The emphasis on the economic as opposed to the political concerns of the Palestinians. It is doomed, Becky, and I'm not saying anything original. Anyone who tells you otherwise is living in Wonderland. That's the reality.
Is it doomed because of the potential change in nature of the US-Saudi relationship? There was much discussion when we knew that this deal was being written, that this was a deal that could be delivered.
Several points quickly. I want to just...
Go on.
The reason why the deal is doomed, not only because it does not take into account the core concerns of the Palestinians. The PA will automatically reject the deal. Automatically. We know that. Because the deal does not really address the core concerns of the Palestinians. In fact, the deal hammers a deadly nail in the policy of Donald Trump in terms of countering Iran. How do you counter Iran if you provide a peace plan that does not address the critical concerns of the Palestinians? Neither Egypt nor Jordan will be able to press the Palestinians, and already the Saudi King Salman has made it very clear more than once. He reaffirmed Saudi commitment to the Palestinian national aspirations, and he says whatever the Palestinians want, Saudi Arabia supports the Palestinians' aspirations. So Donald Trump cannot count on either the Jordanians, the Egyptians, or even the Saudis for this particular matter.
Here's a question for you. Thank you. Here's a question for you. Go on.
Having been the American negotiator in this issue, I've followed it for a long time. There's no question that when this administration came in, it had a concept called outside in. The notion of outside in was somehow Arab leaders could deliver the Palestinians or take the place of the Palestinians. That was always an illusion. Now, over time, I believe the administration has evolved in terms of its attitudes. The truth is, at this point, nobody knows what's in the plan. The people who know aren't talking, and the people who are talking don't know. So the question is, we will see whether the plan meets some basic thresholds. There's no question in my mind that if the administration wants Arabs not to deliver the Palestinians because they cannot, not to pressure the Palestinians publicly to accept it because they will not, but in a sense to embrace the idea that the plan that's being offered could provide a serious basis for negotiations, that in itself would be significant. But to do that, it has to provide for a state that's seen as credible for the Palestinians, and it's going to have to provide for a capital for that state in Arab East Jerusalem. Now, if the plan doesn't have that, then it's going to, at best, it draws silence from Arab leaders, but more likely it draws a rejection.
Let me put this to you. It's a question that's not necessarily asked on a regular basis, maybe never asked at all. When the embassy was moved to Jerusalem, there was sort of much talk that was this the Trump administration saying, you're getting what you wanted, Prime Minister. Now, the ball is in your court. Oftentimes we talk about, will the Palestinians have this deal foisted on them? How about this? Will the Israelis themselves be told to or take the deal, whatever that deal is, unequivocally? Is there a potential for that?
Yeah, I actually believe there is a potential for that, in the sense that you recall a couple of months ago, President Trump said, now it's the Palestinians' turn. The implication was, okay, we've been doing these things for Israel, now it's the Palestinians' turn. The problem is, not long after he said, now it's the Palestinians' turn, he closed the PLO office, he cut off assistance to the Palestinians, and again, I think that fit his model of maximum pressure. Now, he believes maximum pressure works because he thinks it produces people at the negotiating table. I think in this particular case, it kind of ignores that the whole narrative of the Palestinian national movement has been defiance. So when you put pressure on them, defying is a more typical response. Still, having just said that, the point you're raising is you have the Israelis having received a lot from this administration. You have the Prime Minister of Israel emphasizing what a great friend, perhaps the greatest friend ever, that this president represents to Israel. If he comes with a plan that has hard things in it for Israel, it's not so easy for that leadership to then say no.
You shook your head emphatically.
Yes. First of all, the Israelis will not accept the plan if the plan demands substantive concessions from Israel. Of course, the plan will most likely ask Israel for minor concessions on settlements, on illegal boats, probably on the corridor between Gaza and the West Bank, and probably also on the Jordan Valley. The reality is Netanyahu is playing out for time. He's trying to impress on the Trump administration to delay the peace plan. He is basically creating facts on the ground. He's playing Gaza off the PA. And you might have elections in the next few months in Israel. And most probably, the polls show that a more far-right government might really take, the reins of power in Israel. And imagine if such a scenario is to take place.
The other outlier, of course, is 2019 could be the year that Benjamin Netanyahu is indicted.
There are 3 recommendations from the police, 3 different cases recommendations. A lot depends upon what the Attorney General is going to decide. The fact is, the polls do show that Netanyahu is most likely to be the one who could put together another government. I disagree. It's likely to be a more right-wing government. I suspect that if he's able to put together a government, he will want to have a centrist party in there. This government has not been a joy for him. He's constantly been in a position where he's had to maneuver. My guess is, if he's able to put together a government, and we'll have to see, whether the Attorney General makes the decision to go ahead and indict, and if he does, what are the terms of the indictment? If it's breach of trust, the odds are politically he survives. If it's bribery, that may be a very different story within Israel. Then you're opening up, I think, a real kind of political vacuum. You don't really know what the results are likely to be.
If we knew anything about the US file on the Middle East under a Trump administration, it was renewing old ties with old allies, that being a number of countries in this region. It was going after the Iranians and putting them in the administration's crosshairs. And you say that was part of his sort of maximum pressure ideology. And it was that they would deliver this deal of the century. How long does he stay in power, Dennis? Does he run again?
I have a hard time believing that he will not run again. Again, it gets back to
because it will
whether...
become clear in 2019, won't it? I mean, one assumes.
Yeah, but look, this is a president who defines himself as a winner. So not running again, what does that say? Does that imply that he's winning? You know, I think in his own, you know, the way he defines things, that not running again would be an admission of defeat. Now, it's possible that, you know, what Miller comes up with turns out to be something that he finds sufficiently threatening that maybe, on the one hand, as long as he's president, he can't be indicted. At least that seems to be the practice. You know, it's conceivable that depending on what Miller comes up with, there also could be some discussions about some kind of a deal. But again, we don't know what he's going to come up with. I see all the time kind of breathless reporting about this is the key turning point. Well, I've seen multiple key turning points. So until Mueller comes out with something, we really won't know where things are. And we'll have to see whether or not the new dynamics in the Congress change the reality of what one might otherwise predict.
We should definitely expect to see more oversight. Is there a risk that we will see overkill?
Yes.
From a new Democrat-run House?
I think the Democrats have to walk a fine line, because on the one hand, look, they have a right to carry out investigations that have been stymied by those certainly in the House. On the other hand, they also want to look like they're able to govern, that they're focused on an agenda that addresses what are real people's needs, and that what they're doing in terms of investigations is not a diversion away from that. But I think on the other hand, you know, they've certainly been at a point where, having had no power in effect the first 2 years, there is a tremendous impulse to, in a sense, have their needs, have their role somehow felt.
Very quickly, clearly the Mueller investigation will inform the answer to this, and we don't know when that's coming. We don't know whether that report is wrapped in beautiful Christmas wrapping and will be delivered to the White House on Christmas Eve. Who knows? But do you see the potential for a less contentious US-Russia relationship going forward in 2019?
I do think there's a kind of irony here, because if you look at the position of President Trump, his posture towards President Putin is clearly one that never seems to be critical. On the other hand, if you look at the actual actions of the administration, they tend to be pretty tough-minded. So there's a kind of dichotomy, or even a kind of schizophrenia, between where the president is and where the administration is. If the president, I think, is able to shape things the way he wants, just given what we've seen him say, he wants a summit, I think, with Putin. I think he wants to show that he can manage the relationship for the better. You know, I think his administration clearly will continue to advise a tougher posture, but he's demonstrated that he tends to do what he wants to do.
I'm going to come to North Korea with you shortly, but I want to get on to Europe, because you spoke about the trends of nationalism and populism. We see an awful trend of xenophobia in some parts of Europe as well. Do these trends in 2019, Bernardino, constitute a fundamental threat to the European project, to the European Union? And as we see the narrative from the Brits develop, or not, as the case may be, and now we've got another date, the 21st of January, I think, before Theresa May, if she is still Prime Minister, can deliver a renegotiated Brexit deal. Just how concerned are you about an existential threat to the European project at present? I know you've been in Spain, for example, your home country, recently. You were making, behind the scenes, some fascinating observations of just what you've seen there.
Yes, I'm just coming back from Spain, from these elections in Andalusia, which is the biggest region in Spain, where for the first time after more than 50 years, the left has lost the government, and we have seen the extreme right getting 12 seats in the regional parliament. This is unprecedented, and it means that a country that was supposed to be a safe haven from this populist extreme right is now also part of that. Now, look, Europe is going to be much more difficult now. If I tell you Angela Merkel, that's something easy. If I tell you Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, it's a very complicated, we will say AKK, but of course, I mean, look, nationalism is not a threat anymore. It's there. Is the Brexit is nationalism. So we have lost the British, which is a big loss for the European project. Is affecting German politics. She will have a more difficult time. She's a more, traditional Adenauer style. She's a Catholic. She speaks French. She's very, but the politics there are very complicated. Her two rivals were quite nationalist German leaders. So it is going to be more difficult there. Italy, of course, Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, etc. This is not a threat. It's there, is affecting not existentially, but it is undermining the European project. And she has already made clear that Germany is going to support strong proposals for reform coming from Macron and other European governments. Xenophobia, I mean, I don't think Europe is xenophobic, Europe's streets are plenty of foreigners. You have this anti-migration politics, but many of the people voting for that have not seen or have not experienced foreigners. I mean, look at the Brexit vote with many small villages in England without a substantial percent of migrants. London,
but that's an issue.
London, which is a multicultural city, voted against Brexit. So I think these trends will be there, not dangerously. Nationalism is a different issue. However, my concern is not nationalism, is what is behind. This is a real...
Is
what is behind. Because there is a real threat. And as I said before, judo is about using the weaknesses of your rival. If you see many of these nationalistic movements in Europe, you will see a foreign hand pushing, using this to undermine Europe, and this is a threat. This is a real threat.
You're shaking your head.
Becky, let me just contextualize your question. As an undergraduate, I read a book, and most of you probably have seen the book by the famous American sociologist Daniel Bell. It's called The End of Ideology. The End of Ideology, written in the 1960s, Daniel Bell made the argument that changes and shifts, that the world was moving to a global village. Industrialization was going to really wipe out any changes among humanity, where all we become our taste, our hopes, our aspirations, we will be part of one global village. What has happened now is that post-industrialization has ravaged many parts of the Western world, urban areas and in the countryside. I mean, think of the cities in the United States. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the urban centers that ravaged by post-industrialization really allowed Donald Trump to be elected president. The same thing, as you said, travel to Britain, the countryside in Britain. Hardly any major economic development, no opportunities, and the same thing in France, in Italy, and other places. So to come back to your question, no. The far right, authoritarian populism has not reached its peak yet. The tide is on its side. There is no counter-narrative. Essentially, this is an economic crisis. It goes back to the global crisis of 2008. The plight of the middle classes and the lower middle classes has not improved. And what the far right has done is to co-opt significant segments of the lower class and the middle class.
If you say that Europe hasn't seen the crest of that yet, what are the consequences of a further rise in the far right in 2019?
I am very much worried about France. I really, not just me. I mean, I teach in France. My students tell me, well, I teach at Sciences Po and the Sorbonne, they tell me we live in a bubble. Go and travel outside Paris and see really what's happening, in various parts of France. Imagine if France falls to the far right. Italy has already done so. Austria. I mean, I myself, who has lived most of my life between the United States and Europe, I had never imagined that the new fascism would really, make a comeback in Italy and Germany, of all the countries in the world. It has. It's there. And in fact, this is why the far right is imposing a culturalist identity narrative on an essentially economic crisis.
Is this a complete deficit in leadership in Europe? What can be done, I guess, is the question. Because we've seen a similar trend, a similar but perhaps not as significant a trend in the US, although the headlines might suggest otherwise.
As you said, in the midterm election, you saw something change. I mean, the fact that the Democrats did as well as they did, and look where they did well. They did well in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The three states that basically won the election.
Yeah, if you were getting positive about this, then Fawaz.
A new social pact that really anchored in distributive justice, the taxation system that takes into account progressive taxation system, and also the liberals and progressives must really formulate a counter-narrative. A counter-narrative that basically, faces the far-right resurgent narrative. There is no such counter-narrative at this particular point.
I promised that we would go to the audience with 10 minutes to go. We now have 2 minutes and 9 seconds. Can I ask one question very briefly? Are we going to witness more attempts towards the normalization of relations between the US and North Korea in 2029? More real attempts? Or are we going to see real normalization? Perhaps I should...
We'll see the attempt because you'll have another summit, I believe, between...
Maximum pressure.
Yeah, but it's... Look, the key is that the president has made it clear that he thinks that the summit with Kim Jong-un worked. Now, the problem is that the North Koreans haven't been prepared to give an inventory of all their capabilities. My guess is that what will emerge from the summit is some version of that inventory, although I myself wouldn't be overly optimistic that it will be all that forthcoming. I think it'll be there, but it may make Bashar al-Assad's inventory of his chemical weapons look like he was being forthcoming.
You are prepared to be found wrong on that, though? I mean, you're not the eternal pessimist on North Korea,
look, I hope we succeed. But I just say, again, to be fair, the reality is coming into 2017, the major preoccupation was how could you get a suspension of the testing of warheads and missiles, which we have actually seen. So that's why the sense was we were moving towards a real conflict.
Microphones as quickly as put to, just pass them to, yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Hamdi Hassan. I'm from Zayed University. I would like to bring to the table a missing point, which is a narrative of rising Africa, which is, it has a lot of impact on the Middle East and many issues that we are discussing. We are not anymore concerned about America and who's going to there. So the rising Africa narrative, which is the impact of new leaders like Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, you have new leaders like Paul Kagame, the rising economy, and you have 6 countries, the fast growing economies coming from Africa. So what is the impact of this rising narrative on the Middle East, on the Gulf?
Excellent.
And this is the impact even of the global rising of the Gulf
we'll sit on that question.
With Africa. Thank you very much.
We'll sit on that question. Yes, one over here, 2 over here, please.
A question for His Excellency Dennis Ross. Ian Brimmer earlier today seemed to insinuate that the US is genuinely no longer interested in the Middle East. Not just the current administration, but he believes that there is kind of almost a grassroots belief that the US should disengage. Do you agree or disagree?
Can I give, yes, I address whichever of those you like, but I think given your position in training new diplomats for the UAE, some of whom will be going into Africa, of course. I think it was a very good question from you, sir, and if you can just attempt to take that one on.
Yes, I think it's a very important question, and we should talk more about Africa, of course. 3 trends in a second. Economically, we'll see more China, and this will affect the Middle East. We will see China looking for more resources. They have already, there is more than 1 million Chinese working in Africa at this moment, is a huge presence looking for resources there in the Middle East. Politically, I think we will see in countries in the south, like South Africa, Botswana, and others, modern states and modern politics, same as I hope we will see more in the Maghreb. Tunisia's model should expand to countries like Algeria and Morocco. So these are two positive trends. But we will see also more problems in the area of fracture, where the Arab Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa meet, especially the Sahel and Central Africa, and this is going to be complicated and challenging.
Fawaz.
I'm really sad to say that the Middle East is still important for the United States, but for the wrong reasons. I would like the Middle East to be important for the right reasons, in terms of helping to really trigger broadly defined development, trying to mediate between the Palestinians and Israelis in a genuine matter, playing a positive role in helping end the civil wars that are spiraling in the region. I mean, in Syria, where's the United States? $200 million. The United States was supposed to donate $200 million to help rebuild the city of Raqqa. What did President Trump do? He pulled the $200 million at the last moment. How can a great power like the United States of America play a decisive role in the Middle East if it's unwilling to basically contribute $200 million to a city that its forces destroyed in the war against ISIS? This tells you where are we at this particular moment. And I'm afraid this is not just a moment, a transitional moment. This really has to do with structural changes in the American political system and public opinion as well.
You guys have been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Audience, thank you.